You're watching the Everything Network. On the night of April 13th, 1991, the quiet block in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, looked like any other middle-class corner of the city. The kind of place where neighbors recognized each other's cars and kids rode bikes up and down the sidewalk. But in the driveway of one brick house sat a 1991 Lincoln Town Car that belonged to a man whose life had been tied to violence for decades. That man was Bartolomeo "Bobby" Boriello, a maid soldier in the Gambino crime family, a trusted bodyguard and enforcer for John Gotti throughout the boss's high-profile heyday in the 1980s. As he stepped toward his car that evening, the long arc of his life in South Brooklyn mob culture, from Gallo enforcer to feared hitter, from Colombo associate to Gambino power, ended in a brief, brutal burst of gunfire, 2 shots to the head and 5 more into his torso, leaving him dying in the street beside the Lincoln while his wife Susan and their 2 young children remained inside the house, unaware that the war he had helped wage across New York's underworld had finally come home to their front yard. To understand how Boriello reached that driveway, the story begins in South Brooklyn, in a neighborhood where 3 of New York's 5 families, the Gambino, Genovese, and Colombo organizations, were simply part of the landscape. From a young age, he was surrounded by wise guys, absorbing the codes, the swagger, and the possibilities that came with organized crime. His older brother Stevie moved in the orbit of Crazy Joe Gallo and his brothers, Albert Gallo and Frank Iliano, and Stevie's role in securing the Gallo crew's South Brooklyn rackets helped open the door for Bobby to enter that same world. A big kid from the start, Bobby quickly earned a reputation as muscle, an enforcer for the Gallo outfit, a man other men called when they wanted someone frightened, hurt, or gone. Between 1967 and 1972, his rap sheet reflected that role. At least 6 arrests on charges ranging from weapons possession and assault to larceny, gambling, and the other routine street crimes that came with that life. Yet, he consistently avoided serious prison time, a pattern that reflected both his growing usefulness to powerful mob figures and the political connections those figures wielded on his behalf. As the Gallo crew fractured after Joey Gallo's murder in 1972, the South Brooklyn rackets shifted and Bobby moved with them, transitioning from the Gallo orbit and the Colombo crime family toward the Gambinos, who were consolidating influence in trucking, construction, and waterfront industries. By the 1980s, amid the era of RICO indictments and wiretaps, he had become a made man in the Gambino family, officially inducted on December 24, 1988. On that night, he was brought to a modest Mulberry Street apartment in Little Italy, property belonging to the mother of Joseph Corrao, where several prospective inductees waited. Among them, John Gotti Jr., Dominic Pizzonia, and Nicholas Lasorsa. In that cramped room stood captains John D'Amico and Gene Gotti. Seated at the table, administering the oath, were underboss Sammy Gravano and Pasquale Conte. It was a ceremony designed to legitimize not only Bobby's membership, but also the elevation of Gotti's own son, allowing John Gotti to avoid the appearance of favoring his bloodline by having his boy inducted alongside other respected figures such as Boriello and Mikey Scars de Leonardo. In the years that followed, Boriello's role inside the Gambinos expanded, and his personal closeness to the Gotti inner circle became obvious. He developed strong ties with John Gotti himself, with Gravano, and with Nicholas and Jojo Carozzo, often spending weekends on Long Island in a mix of business and pleasure, gambling, partying, and attending performances, including shows by singer Jay Black, a childhood friend of Gotti. His home base in Brooklyn was a network of social clubs, a Carroll Gardens spot he owned, run by his brother Stevie, and the One Over Golf Club, operated by Gambino soldier Joe Pitts Canigliaro, a paraplegic gangster entrenched in loan sharking and gambling. From these hubs, Bobby managed loan shark books, gambling operations, and enforcement work that stretched across Manhattan, Queens, Staten Island, and especially South Brooklyn. His name became linked, sometimes in law enforcement files, sometimes in whispered street talk, to extortion, contract killings, car bombings, drug trafficking, and several unsolved gangland slayings, giving him a reputation as one of the Gambino family's most capable and dangerous hitters. Internally, Boriello's status was reflected in his formal place on the organizational chart. After John Gotti promoted his son to captain and created a crew around him, something pushed in part by Sammy Gravano, Bobby was assigned to that Gotti Jr. crew. Alongside men like John Cavallo, Charles Carneglia, and Thomas Cacciapoli, and later Dominic Fat Dom D'Ambrosio, Vincent Vinny Bucciaroni, Carmine Agnello, and Craig De Palma, Boriello emerged as the most powerful and trusted figure in the group. Associates such as Steve Kaplan, Frank Lividisi, and the Dobies brothers were funneling money from strip clubs and other ventures up the ladder, and by the late 1980s, Kaplan was paying tribute to both Bobby and Junior Gotti on strip club business running up and down the East Coast, including lucrative operations in Atlanta, Georgia. Recognizing his strength and his value, the family elevated Boriello to acting captain of Gotti Jr.'s crew, giving him authority over significant loan sharking, construction, trucking, and gambling interests that fit the traditional Gambino profile. Violence remained woven through his business. When John Gotti grew dissatisfied with Gambino soldier Louis De Bono, who had secured a lucrative contract to install fireproofing foam in the Twin Towers and was suspected of not kicking up properly, Gotti ordered the problem solved. According to later accounts, Boriello took care of De Bono, eliminating him, after which Sammy Gravano took control of the fireproofing business. A shift that created tension inside the family and underscored how killings often functioned as business decisions. At the same time, Bobby's name surfaced in federal investigative files and informant statements about the December 1985 assassination of former Gambino boss Paul Castellano outside Sparks Steakhouse. A Gambino informant identified him as one of the shooters in that high-profile hit, describing him as one of the family's most accomplished killers, though these accusations never resulted in a conviction. The danger of the life cut both ways. In one episode that would later prove significant, Boriello tried to kill a Genovese crime family associate named Preston Garitano on a Brooklyn street. The hit failed, and the attempt forced a delicate inter-family negotiation. The Gambinos and the Genovese sat down to decide whether Garitano would live or die. In the end, he was allowed to live, but the attempt left an open question of revenge and exposed Boriello personally to potential payback, as well as further entanglements between the families. Meanwhile, law enforcement scrutiny of Boriello was intensifying. By the time of his last months, he was the target of multiple federal agencies and the Kings County District Attorney's Office on a cocaine trafficking conspiracy case, and for his suspected role in Castellano's murder, pressure that robbed him of the relative invisibility he had enjoyed earlier in his career. The bullet that finally reached him, however, did not come from within the Gambino family, and it did not appear to be the product of Genovese retaliation, despite what John Gotti initially believed. On the street, and even in Gotti's own mind, suspicion fell on Genovese boss Vincent Chin Gigante, who had long opposed Gotti and his flashy rule. But investigators later identified the real architect of the hit as Lucchese underboss Anthony Gaspipe Casso. According to US law enforcement, Casso ordered the murder in retaliation for the killing of Lucchese member Patrick Testa, and as part of a broader strategy to squeeze the Gambinos during an underworld struggle over control of New York rackets. The man who actually pulled the trigger was Frank Lastarino, a Lucchese mobster with a long history inside the family, who had been involved in extortion, loan sharking, and illegal gambling since the 1970s, and had risen through the Brooklyn faction under bosses like Anthony Corallo and Vittorio Musso. Lastarino, seeking promotion to consigliere, and already regarded as one of the most feared hitmen in the Lucchese organization, carried out the hit as a demonstration of loyalty and capability. Casso's reach extended deep into the New York City Police Department through detectives Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa, often referred to in later accounts as the Mafia Cops. In Boriello's case, law enforcement reports state that these officers provided intelligence on his Bensonhurst address and movements, conducting surveillance that allowed Lastarino to know when and where to strike. Weeks before the shooting, a broad-shouldered NYPD detective had come alone to the Boriello family's new home, asking Susan if her husband lived there. She would later identify that detective as Eppolito after seeing his photograph on the news, a detail that sharpened the picture of how deeply compromised the NYPD had been by Casso's influence. On April 13, 1991, with the surveillance complete, Lastarino waited outside the house. As Bobby approached his Lincoln, the Lucchese gunman stepped forward and opened fire, hitting him in the head and body and leaving him fatally wounded on the pavement in front of his own home, while his family remained inside. The fallout rippled through the underworld. When John Gotti heard of Boriello's murder from his cell, he was reportedly furious. From prison, he directed Gambino representatives to meet with the Genovese leadership to determine the fate of Preston Giratano, sometimes spelled Geritano, whom the Gambinos may still have suspected as being involved or at least as a lingering problem from the earlier failed hit. At a sit-down with Genovese acting boss Liborio Bellomo, Sammy Gravano pressed for Giratano's execution in keeping with Gotti's wishes, but nothing ultimately came of the push. In a different kind of sanction, Gotti sent word back to South Brooklyn, telling Stevie Boriello that he had the boss's personal permission to avenge his brother's death, however he saw fit, and that the full weight of the Gambino family stood behind him. An unusual and potent authorization in a world where unsanctioned killings were supposed to be forbidden. In the end, Bobby Boriello's life is a compact case study in the modern mafia. A kid born into a neighborhood dominated by wise guys, pulled early into the orbit of a notorious crew, hardened through street violence and a series of arrests that never quite landed, and then elevated through formal induction, personal relationships, and a proven willingness to kill. He operated at the intersection of old-world rackets, loan sharking, gambling, extortion, and newer streams of money in strip clubs and construction contracts. He was suspected in one of the most famous mob hits of the late 20th century and directly connected to another. And he lived in a world where loyalty to a boss like Gotti could coexist with quiet resentment and internal tension over who controlled which profitable operation. His death, facilitated not only by rival mobsters but by corrupt police officers on a crime family's payroll, underscored how far the reach of organized crime extended into institutions meant to uphold the law. And the image that remains, of a career mobster cut down beside his luxury car while his wife and children sat unknowingly inside their Brooklyn home, captures the essential contradiction of that life: power and money on the street, vulnerability and collateral damage at home, and an ending that, in retrospect, feels less like a surprise than an inevitability written into the life he chose decades before. At the time of his murder, Boriello had been under investigation by multiple federal agencies and the Kings County District Attorney's Office for directing a cocaine trafficking conspiracy, as well as his suspected involvement in the murder of former family boss Paul Castellano. In fact, a Gambino informant fingered Boriello as one of the shooters in the slaying, reasoning that Boriello had been one of the more accomplished hitters in the family. When John Gotti heard about Boriello's murder, he was furious. From prison, Gotti ordered Gambino family members to meet with the leaders of the Genovese crime family concerning the whereabouts of Preston Giratano, who the Gambinos might have suspected as Boriello's killer at the time. Keeping to their earlier agreement, they agreed to kill Giratano. Preston Giratano was a real Genovese family member and Gambino crime family associate that Boriello tried to kill on a Brooklyn street, firing shots at him in public. Salvador Gravano attended a sit-down with Genovese acting boss Liborio Bellomo, seeking Giratano's execution, but nothing ever came of it. John Gotti sent word to Stevie Boriello, giving him permission to avenge his brother's death by killing whoever he needed to, and that he had the backing of the entire Gambino family. However, it wasn't until 2004 that Giratano was stabbed to death outside a Bay Ridge, Brooklyn restaurant. Stevie Boriello would remain involved with the Gambino family after his brother's death, handling the loan sharking, gambling, and extortion rackets in Brooklyn and Staten Island, where he currently resides. Toward the year of 1994, massive indictments of labor and construction racketeering, extortion, loan sharking, illegal gambling, and murder charges were put on dozens of members of the crime family, including Lastarino, who was charged with the murder of Bartholomew Boriello and the attempted murder conspiracies on Stephen Crea and Gotti Jr., and Nicholas Carasso, as well as additional racketeering charges. Lastarino was sentenced to 20 years in prison and placed at the Fort Dix Federal Correctional Institution in Fort Dix, New Jersey.